I'm Professor Cyrus Patel. This is American Literature 1 from the beginnings to the Civil War, V410230, and I will be your drill sergeant for the term. I'm not kidding. This is boot camp for English majors, you may have heard. And we are going to read a lot of stuff. We're going to be doing some serious analytical writing, and by the end of the term, with any luck, your literary scholar's chops will be a lot stronger than they are right now. So it is, I will say right at the outset, historically speaking, it's been the kind of course where if you put more effort into it, you are rewarded more than perhaps in someone else's course. So if you're used to getting a B plus and you put more effort in, I'd expect you to get an A or an A minus. If you're used, however, to cruising and kind of getting a B, students like that have tended to get C's. So I'm not really supposed to say something like, if you have to cut a corner in a class because, you know, life is busy and everything, there's many things going on, cut it in somebody else's class. So I didn't actually say that. That's actually a literary device, and there will be a special prize for anybody who emails me afterwards and tells me what that literary device was that I just used. But in any case, I'm serious about that. This is a course that requires a lot from you. I'm not going to kid you. The reading load is comparatively heavier. It probably is slightly heavier than Brit.Lit 1 or Brit.Lit 2. I have more expectations of you, perhaps, but you will be rewarded if you do the work. So if anybody would like to run screaming out the door and take it in a different term when somebody else is up here, now would be the time. No takers? All right, then let's get started. So it's the first anniversary of Barack Obama's inauguration, so it seemed to be a moment when it would make sense to talk about some of the principles that he embodies. He recently received the Nobel Prize for Peace, the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think he deserved it, and I think he deserved it because of the ways in which he has set a particular agenda for how we should all conduct ourselves as citizens, individuals, and indeed as nations, right? And that way of conducting ourselves is based on the idea, fundamentally, I think, of conversation and dialogue. And so that's one of the things that I want to be thinking about in the course of the term. This is what he said. We remain a young nation, but in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness, right? So one of the things I'm going to want you to understand in the course of the term is the tradition of rhetoric and writing that words like this come out of, right? The invocation of Scripture, the invocation of a reference to the Bible, right? The whole idea of pursuing happiness. Obama is inserting himself in this speech into a rhetorical tradition, and it's one that I hope you will come to understand because it's a rhetorical tradition that works not only through sermons and then political speeches, but also deeply marks what we might think of as the purely literary tradition, what we tend to call American literature. And we'll be talking in the course of the hour about what those words, American and literature, should be taken to mean. One of the ideas I want to put right out on the table is the idea of cosmopolitanism, because I think that's one of the things that Obama and his approach to politics and diplomacy, one of the things that he embodies. Now, can somebody tell me what they think cosmopolitanism means? And if you were in my Con West class, forgo for just a minute. Anybody else? What does cosmopolitanism mean? It's a word that we sling around a lot here in New York City and at NYU. So what does it mean? Sure. Members of all nations. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. The idea of all nations, yeah.
Diversity.
Diversity, sure, yeah.
Being a citizen of the world.
Being a citizen of the world, yes. That, in fact, is the derivation of the term cosmopolites, right? For Greek, citizen of the cosmos. So it's beyond, no, I didn't pay him. But there's nice timing there, right? Okay, so the idea of being the citizen of the world as opposed to primarily the citizen of a nation. So when we're thinking about nations, we're thinking about it in a kind of plural sense. You might say that cosmopolitanism arose, whether you believe it arose amongst the Greeks, so say as a rejoinder to the idea of the polis, or the city-state. So if you were in ancient Greece, perhaps your first identity, if you were a citizen, was as a citizen of Sparta or Athens. Maybe later on, during the Persian Wars, you thought of yourself as something like a Greek. The Stoic philosophers and others who talked about cosmopolitanism wanted to think in bigger terms. In the 18th century, with the rise of the nation-state, cosmopolitanism becomes an alternative to the idea that your primary allegiance is owed to the nation. Somebody who happens to teach at a little school uptown has written a little bit about cosmopolitanism, and Bruce Robbins suggests that cosmopolitanism should be understood as a fundamental devotion to the interests of humanity as a whole. That's one way to think about it. And he points out again that cosmopolitanism has seemed to claim universality by virtue of its independence, its detachments from the bonds, commitments, and affiliations that constrain ordinary nation-bound lives, right? So nations in this conception are things that might keep us apart, right? Nations have borders, boundaries. They keep people from one another. They're separate identities. Cosmopolitanism breaks down those boundaries, creates something like what we might think of as universality. Joins all people together. Humanity, these are all the words that get associated with cosmopolitanism. But it isn't quite so simple. In the 18th century, and I just put up Kant as an example of one of the thinkers who's working through some of these ideas, there are a number of different ways proposed to be cosmopolitan. Perhaps if you are a citizen of the world, there shouldn't be any nations. Right? Kant, in his earlier pieces, starts to think about the idea of a world government that would be beyond nations. By the time he gets to the piece, Perpetual Peace, he started thinking in slightly different terms. It becomes more like what we just mentioned earlier, all nations, or the idea that the nation is still somehow valuable. My colleague in sociology, Clary Calhoun, has made a powerful argument about the continuing usefulness of the idea of the nation. But maybe that's not the last word. In other words, we need to think of, perhaps Kant was suggesting, about a kind of federation of nations in which something that's distinctive about a national tradition would be preserved, but something larger that could bind people together would also be created. And I think that is a kind of conceptual leap that starts to open the door for more contemporary, by that I mean some of the ways in which people are thinking about cosmopolitanism today, which move beyond simply this notion of an alternative to the nation and really start to take on this idea of universality. So David Hollinger, who's an intellectual historian who teaches at Berkeley, has written a book called Postethnic America in which he talks about multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. And he writes that cosmopolitanism shares with all varieties of universalism a profound suspicion of enclosures, but it's defined by an additional element which is not essential to universalism itself, and he calls this the recognition, acceptance, and eager exploration of diversity. Cosmopolitanism, Hollinger says, urges each individual and collective unit to absorb as much varied experience as it can while retaining its capacity to advance its aims effectively. For cosmopolitans, the diversity of humankind is a fact. For universalists, it's a potential problem. Now, what does that mean? Think of it this way. If you're a universalist thinker, you're interested in making generalizations about humankind, about men and women and the ways in which they share certain attributes. Right? You might want to do philosophy that's talking about the soul, for example, or about rights, or something like that, something that everyone shares. So you have to figure out a way, conceptually, to get beyond the idea of difference. You need to figure out a way to minimize difference. Perhaps you might say you need to find a lowest common denominator, or at least a common denominator. So difference is a problem that you want to solve, so that then you can make generalizations that apply to everybody. That's the kind of universalist practice. Cosmopolitans don't think of difference as a problem. Cosmopolitans think of it, I would say, as an opportunity. So I'd go even beyond Hollinger. Hollinger suggests that cosmopolitans see diversity as a fact. I'd say for the true cosmopolitan, diversity, difference are opportunities that we should embrace, not problems that we need to solve. Right? If you go to some foreign country You go from New York, you go to, I don't know, Seoul or Shanghai or Abu Dhabi. You want it to be a little different, don't you? You don't want, I mean, you get off the airport in Abu Dhabi, you'll see a Starbucks right away, that's true. But then there will be people dressed radically differently ordering at that Starbucks. That will be a kind of trivial example of the interplay of what I would call, and what Anthony Appiah, a theorist of cosmopolitanism, calls the idea of cosmopolitanism as universality plus difference. Cosmopolitanism certainly is linked to the idea of universality, right? As Robbins' quote suggested, it is about how, in part, we are the same, but cosmopolitanism is not afraid of difference and diversity. So in the slogan form that Appiah presents here, it's universality plus difference. We want Seoul as a city to be different so that we have that kind of experience of seeing new things, finding practices that are other than ours, hearing stories, accounts of the world that are different from our own. We grow as people, whatever you want to say. There's something about going someplace and finding it to be different that's exciting. And yet, if it's completely alien, you wouldn't be able to make that connection. You need some shared basis to have that cosmopolitan experience. So you go and you find that the people who live in Seoul, Korea are all people too. Wow, and they have certain ideas that you have at home. That's a kind of shared basis. The universal thinker might want to then collapse the gulf of difference that exists between New York and Seoul, right? Stress the ways in which those two cities and the inhabitants of those cities are the same. The cosmopolitan wants to maintain the gap and then bridge it. So we maintain the gap, we bridge it, or you might say we have conversations across the boundaries of difference without wanting to get rid of the boundaries of difference. So that's a crucial thing. Now, one of the things else to say about this is that cosmopolitanism is not the same as multiculturalism, which has become a byword in the US Academy in the aftermath of what we called the culture wars in the 1980s. Multiculturalism is a pretty good thing. It respects the diversity of different cultural traditions, right? It's been very important in terms of allowing people who come from minority traditions to feel that they have a voice within US culture. But multiculturalism has ties less to universality or universalism than it does to pluralism, right? Separate, and perhaps separate but equal traditions. Now, pluralism, as we'll come to understand, is a very important part of the American intellectual tradition. In multiculturalism, it tends to break down to something like this. If you're a multiculturalist, you recognize the dignity of, the importance of many other cultural traditions. But you also say you understand the pull of a cultural tradition for the person who's in it. So the logic would go something like this. I like my culture because it's mine. You like your culture because it's yours. I respect your culture because I'm a good multiculturalist. I want you to respect my culture. I'm not going to say too much about your culture, because I don't walk in your shoes. I don't know what your culture is like. I feel like I should respect those boundaries of difference, live and let live, separate but equal, the dignity of all different cultural traditions. Now, the cosmopolitans would say that's fine as far as it goes. But there's a problem. If you're a multiculturalist and you want to respect a long-standing cultural tradition, okay, that's good. That's a good principle. What if that cultural tradition is less than what we want it to be? Let's say there's a long-standing cultural tradition in another part of the world. It's had an unbroken culture for 2,000 years. It's very well established. Seems to work for the people that live there. It's based on slavery. Do we want, as cosmopolitans, to be able to say that's just okay? They're different. We should respect their idea. Or do we want to have an idea of human rights that we want to promote and say, you know what? Human beings should never be enslaved. That's one cultural tradition that we should get over and find a different way to organize it. A multiculturalist would have a hard time sticking to her principles and then making that argument. The cosmopolitan, on the other hand, she might say, look, what we need to do is engage in a constructive conversation with that other culture. And you know what? We should open up our own selves to being convinced that maybe the way they do it is better. In other words, you need to have deep conversations, conversations that put cherished values up for grabs. Right? I think that's what is behind some of the thinking of Barack Obama. We need to engage in conversations, and not just because in the sense that we think we're the teachers and we have a better story to tell. The cosmopolitan realizes that, in a way, part of the importance of conversation comes from the fact that as human beings, we aren't perfect, right? And that it may well be that other cultures, other people have better accounts of the world than we do. We ought to listen. We ought to be engaging in these conversations in a way that makes us want, at least able to be convinced. Real conversations about non-trivial matters. All right? So to sum it up, cosmopolitanism starts off as a critique of nationalism, ends up in current theory as being a kind of critique of universalism. And I want to link it to the words that Barack Obama has tended to use in the past, which are the idea of deliberative democracy. I think when he goes through a series, a line of political theory that calls itself deliberative democracy theory, but if you were to read it, you would find that it has a lot in common with a kind of Bruce Robbins, Anthony Appiah strain of cosmopolitan thinking that I've been outlining. And one final thing, one of the things that seems to be linked to cosmopolitanism in the American mind is the idea of urbanism, that the city is a place where cosmopolitan interaction really happens. That leads to some interesting ideas, right? One of them may well be that we live in the paradigmatic American city, perhaps, New York. So what about New York? Is New York the most American place in the country? Or is it the least American place in the country? What you think about that question will have something to do with your take on the American ideological tradition. That ideological tradition is one of the things that we'll be talking about this term. My colleague in history, Tom Bender, has talked about the rise of two great cultural mythologies. And this course will be taking on one of those more deeply than the other to show how an ideological tradition takes place, how in part it takes place through writing and later through what we call the literary, and how it makes us think about an idea like the idea of cosmopolitanism. So one of the things that Bender suggests is that there's two mainstream American cultural traditions. If people talk about an American identity, they're thinking about one of these two things, he would say. One of them has to do with Massachusetts, where I spent a lot of time and used to like very much, and has to do with Puritanism and sacred culture and urban culture, town-based culture, the Puritan origins of the American self. That has been the story of American literature, one, for many, many years, and it's starting to be undone, you might say, in the last part of the 20th century and now. So we'll be talking about that story and trying to understand what are the strengths of that account of American intellectual history, and also what some of its weaknesses are. There's another story that Bender points to, and that's the kind of Virginia story. We'll be touching on that. But that suggests that the real American identity comes out of not towns, but the country, the pastoral, not sacred experience, but secular experience. Hector St. John Crève-Coeur writes about the American farmer as the kind of prototypical America. That's a powerful tradition too. So you might think of these two versions of the American self, probably intermingling. What Bender points out is that they seem like they're different, but they both reject the idea of difference. Neither, he says, can give positive cultural or political value to heterogeneity or conflict. Each, in its own way, is xenophobic, and that distances both of them from the conditions of modern life, especially as represented by the historic cosmopolitanism of New York and increasingly other cities in the United States. Okay? So one of the things we're asking is, to what extent does New York, if it is indeed linked to cosmopolitanism, offer a third possibility for an ideological tradition, one that perhaps hasn't been sufficiently taken up, or that maybe remains to be taken up? And then we'll think about what the relation of our literary tradition is to all of these things. Will there be moments that we will find in our survey of American literature from the beginnings to the eve of the Civil War that belong strongly to one tradition or the other, and other moments perhaps that offer a kind of invitation to cosmopolitanism? These are some of the issues that we're going to be taking up. One outgrowth of the idea of cosmopolitanism that comes from Appiah's work is the idea that cosmopolitan traditions are not pure. Right? Think about the multiculturalist, for example. Multiculturalist says, you know what? You better have your departments of African American studies and Asian American studies and women's studies, and because everybody wants, those are good, important stories, and we should keep them separate, and we should keep those departments, and maybe we don't want to mix things up and keep disciplinary boundaries. Cosmopolitan theorists think that, you know what, cultures don't want to remain pure. Cultures want to mix and miscegenate and fertilize one another and inseminate one another and produce new forms, and they're very Whitmanian, as you'll come to see. Appia recoups the word contamination for this. Cultures want to contaminate one another. They want to mix. So one of the things that we'll be working with is a model of culture that presupposes that what culture is about change, that cultural models need to be dynamic. And yet, at the same time, we will often find within any cultural formation that there will be forces at work that want to create pure forms, or maintain pure forms, or maintain traditions, want to conserve the past, right? And you might call these the kind of cultural police, or I don't know what, French people, French linguists wanting to make sure the French language remains pure and free of any Americanisms, right? You could think of any number, I'm sure, of cultural traditions in the world where certain people are legislating about what what their people should be thinking, and trying to keep outside influences outside. Appia would say this is not the way cultures want to behave left to their own devices. They want to mix and miscegenate and contaminate one another. So we'll be working with a model of culture that's drawn from the neo-Marxist thinker Raymond Williams, right? And one of the things to say about Marxist literary criticism is that most Marxists today are probably no longer subscribing to historical materialism in the same way that they used to, or that most Marxist criticism is not necessarily about the overthrow of the capitalist system. That one of the things to say is that Marxism has had a broad influence on the way contemporary literary and cultural studies conduct themselves, in part because Marxist critics had certain insights into the way cultures work. One of those insights, I think, comes from Williams, and it's this model of culture in almost any cultural formation as the interplay of three forms, which he refers to as dominant, residual, and emergent. Okay? And that's one of the things that we'll be wanting to test. Does the literary and cultural history of the United States, in the period that we're looking at, seem to bear out this model of culture? Are there dominant forms that give way, or maybe have taken over, we might say, from residual forms, right? So if we go back to this, dominant, residual, and emergent, it's pretty clear what dominant is, right? It's whatever we take to be at the center of any cultural formation. Residual cultures and emergent cultures, if you think of this as a kind of gravitic center, these are on the periphery, but they're in orbit around that dominant center. In some sense, you might say the definition of what's residual and what's emergent absolutely depends on the existence of a dominant culture, because what these forms are about is conversation with that dominant center, or negotiation with it. So residual culture, according to Williams, consists of those practices that are based on the residue of some previous formation, but continue to play a role in the present. Right? So they're part of the past, but they're not simply archaic. They have a powerful role to play in the present. The present dominant culture will often have to take these forms and practices into account. Here's an example from later on in our course. Journal entry from Waldo Emerson. He writes, "In all my lectures I have taught one doctrine, namely the infinitude of the private man. This the people accept readily enough, and even with loud commendation, as long as I call the lecture art, or politics, or literature, or the household. But the moment I call it religion, they are shocked, though it only be only the application of the same truth which they receive everywhere else to a new class of facts." So one of the things you might say about Emerson is he's trying to push what we will come to see as a new doctrine that grows out of the Enlightenment in the context of a larger biblical culture that we're starting to investigate next week. And he finds that in many ways, people who belong to that still biblical culture are willing to take his ideas and go with them, except when he gets to one particular arena of thought. And there, the residual is still powerful. Right? And Emerson, as a sign of an emergent set of ideas that are becoming dominant, has to take them into account. Residual culture is still powerful culture. Emergent, according to Williams, is on the other end of the spectrum. If residual is linked to the past, emergent is linked to the future, or the new, or what's new from the standpoint of the dominant culture. So it's about new meanings, he says. New values, practices, relationships, and kinds of relationships are continually being created by emergent culture. But it's important to understand that both of these forms exist only in relation to the dominant. You need to understand the canonical tradition, in other words, to understand the challenges from the past from the present and the future to that canonical tradition. So that's part of what we're up to. We're trying to understand how something called an American canon was created, and we're also at the same time going to try to think about what the limitations of that canon-making process are. Okay, so there's a lot of things, I think, that will be of use to you as you go on in your careers as English majors. Okay. First concept I want to talk about for the moment is something called the horizon of expectations. So I'll begin by asking you to tell me where you think the meaning of a text is. If a text has a meaning, where is it? Yes? How you want to relate to the text. Okay, that's a start. Yes?
It's like a collision or merger, like conversation between sort of author and sort of ideas around the author and reader and ideas around the reader.
Good. So the comment was that it's a conversation or a collision between the text and ideas that surround the text and the reader and ideas that surround the reader. I think that's good. That's a good way to start thinking about it. The horizon of expectations comes from a branch of critical theory that we might call the aesthetics of reception, or broadly speaking, reception theory. In the olden days, we used to think that the meaning of the literary text was in the text, right? So if you, in the earlier part of the 20th century, you would say, okay, I'm going to read a poem, and basically everything I need to know about that poem is pretty much in the poem. We called this the new criticism. It was a theory of the way great works of art worked. They were self-contained. And the best ones were complicated and had symbols, and you know, they were really, they gave you different kinds of readings that you can have, but they were still self-contained. Biography, that was kind of extraneous. You know, literary history, what we tend to call this course, that was all extra stuff, context. Text was where it went, was the most important thing. And that was, you could imagine that was great for high school teachers of English, right? You didn't really have to prepare. All you had to do is find a good poem, bring it in, you can talk for your 40 minutes about this poem. It works pretty well. But in part, I think, due to a number of critical traditions, and in part due to some of the advances that come around because of multiculturalism, we've begun to see that the new criticism was underwritten by what we might call an interpretive community. A bunch of readers who shared the same ideas about how the texts work, what's important about texts, a set of shared values. What happens if you're a reader who comes from a radically different tradition and doesn't share those values? Is that text going to mean the same thing to you? Probably not. Is the meaning that you're going to take out of that text invalid? Today we would say probably not. We would say that every text, when it's created, greets what we might call a horizon of expectations. That horizon of expectations is the sum total of, you might say, the kind of cultural and social milieu in which a text is created and in which it's received. We would also say that the author probably has some sense of this. Certainly wouldn't theorize it or think about it openly in these terms, but they have a sense of what they might call writing for an audience, the sense that the audience might expect things. And that is part of the horizon of expectations. The horizon of expectations is the sum total of the historical moment, the moment in the history of artistic forms, right? And it's personal too, the reader's own personal experience of reading. All of this will go into the horizon of expectations that the reader will have when he or she greets the text. And an author intuits that there are going to be these horizons of expectations out there, right? So you might say the fact that you're going to read Moby Dick is going to be, and when you read Moby Dick, for you, the meaning of Moby Dick is going to be profoundly affected by the fact that you know it's a novel. Will not expect it to do the same things that a lyric poem or an epic would do. It's going to be affected by the fact that you know it's a classic novel, right? A classic. Oh. So that's going to give you a certain set of attitudes towards it. Okay, we'll have to work on those. That's important too, right? It's going to be affected by the fact you're reading it under the pressure of a course and knowing that you're going to have to be examined on it and maybe even write about it. All of these things will affect the meaning of Moby Dick for you. And if you come back to it in 20 years, as I hope you will, it will probably mean something different to you then because you will have had 20 years of life experience and reading experience between those two encounters with the text. All of this is part of the horizon of expectations. And it also has to do something with the notion of genre, as I suggested, it's a novel, not a poem, and the notion of particular forms that are current or not current at the moment the author writes. Author can choose to have a number of relations to the horizon of expectations. You can say, you know what, I want to sell a book, so I'm going to give the audience exactly what they want. Dan Brown's thinking to himself, they bought my other books, they'll buy this one. I'll use the same device. I'll have a character who's actually another character, but I won't tell them until about 2/3 of the way through. How many of you have read Dan Brown? In fact, I read all of Dan Brown because I wanted to figure out. I'm like, I'm a poor underpaid English professor. I'm like, how do you do it? This guy taught at Exeter. He's an English professor. How does he do it? I resisted the lost symbol, I have to say. Then I finally read it. Not as good as the Da Vinci Code. How many of you read Angels and Demons? Okay, and the Da Vinci Code? Same book, right? I mean, literally, even the same scene. Like, wasn't there a scene with a tomb and he's underneath? And when I read Angels and Demons, I thought, oh my God. He wrote this book, not enough people read it, so he rewrote it again with a slightly different template, and I guess nobody noticed. Anyway, fine, whatever, it's all fine. But see, that's what we call genre fiction, and in a sense, he's making his own genre. Audiences apparently are not put off by the fact that it's the same formula over and over again. That's one way to approach the horizon of expectations in most genre fiction, as we call it, detective fiction, some science fiction, other things. They just hew to those conventions. There are conventions for the literary novel, too. The literary novel is supposed to be complicated, or it's supposed to be, formally challenging, or whatever. You would hew to those, too, if you're going to do a literary novel. So you're not Dan Brown, pick your favorite literary novels. Philip Roth, you're going to be writing in a way that signals that what you're doing is the literary novel. In the case of Roth, you're also going to be writing knowing that your audience presumably has a set of expectations that are based on what you've written before. You could decide, if you're Roth, to contradict those things, to do something radically different. Or you could decide not to. Sometimes a horizontal change takes place well after the production of a text or the writing of a text. And that's, you'll see, is the case with Moby Dick. Moby Dick is written in the middle of the 19th century, and it's written with clearly literary ambitions. You'll see in sections this week why Melville is clearly signaling that this is not the novel as usual. This is not a personal narrative of the sea like I used to write as usual. This is going to be something different. Yet it was so different that the audiences went, and didn't want to read it, or only a few people understood it. Melville got a little bit bummed out, wrote another book in which he actually took time out, in this book called Pierre, to excoriate the literary publishing world, and then got headlines from reviewers like Herman Melville crazy, and basically his writing career was, in the tubes. For the most part of Melville's life, he gave up writing. He became a clerk in the custom house. And for a long time lived in New York, not writing fiction, writing a little bit of poetry. And when he died, he was forgotten. People, it was, the old joke, people were surprised to read his obituary because they thought he was dead already. I mean, what had happened to Herman Melville? In the 1920s, something happens. One piece is found and published posthumously, the wonderful short piece, Billy Budd. People start looking at Melville once again. There's something that begins to be called the Melville revival that takes place. People start reading Moby Dick again. And then, in the aftermath of World War II, when literary critics and other scholars are trying to prove that the United States, which is now a global power, has a literature, an indigenous literature that stands up there with the big boys and girls, just as good as the Germans and the French and the English, right? They look around. They're doing this in the aftermath of modernism, which has taught us texts should be hard if they're going to be literary, right? Joyce, right? And they say, guess what? We have a modernist novel before there was even modernism, and that novel is called Moby Dick. And Moby Dick got set at the center of the American canon as a result of that. Its meaning changed. It has a horizontal shift which had nothing to do with the writer, you might say, and had everything to do with a very specialized set of readers who could then convey their understandings and their readings to a more generalized set of readers, and all that is in the genealogy of this moment when I'm standing here talking to you about Moby Dick. Okay? So what's one of the things that I want you to understand? The meaning of a text is part of a negotiation, or to use the term that we've brought up earlier, a conversation. And it's important to remember, therefore, that the meaning is going to fly. There are limits. Moby Dick is not a book about a pink elephant, and if you wrote Moby Dick is about a book about a pink elephant, that would actually be wrong. It will be one of these rare occasions when people reading a paper on a literary critic could say that's wrong. So you're bound by certain conventions of the language, right? But within that, there's a lot of play. And we might say that one of the things that, let's take this as a hypothesis, one of the things that makes a great text great is it allows for that kind of free play of meaning. It leaves space for the reader to create meanings of that text. We'll test that as the course continues. All right, just to recap, F.O. Matheson was the guy who wrote a big book that's called American Renaissance that came out in the middle of the 1940s and that really helps to establish the center of the U.S. canon, which is still Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Hawthorne, Melville, and then we would add to that Dickinson, whom Matheson wrote about in a separate place, and sometimes Poe, and there are some others, right? That's still thought to be the center of the American canon. One of the things you're going to get to do is have experience with those writers, and you'll decide if, in fact, that canon is trumped up for all kind of reasons that we really can't respect anymore, or if there is something that remains valuable within that tradition. For Matheson, it was a tradition that embodied the values of democracy, and that's what made it valuable and what made it American. We can test those as well. That book, and therefore the name of that period, were American Renaissance. Okay, let's see. Let's talk about that first. Literature. What is literature? Everybody took literary, who took literary interpretation? Everyone, okay, good. So you all remember everything you learned there, right? And what is literature? Didn't they tell you? What did they tell you it was? Yes. Any written words. Dan Brown is literature. The New York Times is literature. Your syllabus is literature. That might be a little bit too far on the promiscuous side of it, but we'll keep that as a possibility. What else?
Well, there's the difference between lowercase literature and capital L literature, which is something that they have made like a hierarchy scale of good literature, bad literature.
Okay, I'll stop you. So, it's being suggested that there's capital L literature, lowercase l literature, and that within the literary there's actually a hierarchy of literary forms. What does that do with other kinds of writing then? I mean, is Dan Brown bad literature or lowercase literature, or is literature going to have to be just L with a capital L literature? Does that mean it's associated with some big tradition? All right, we'll keep that as a possibility, the L, the capital and lowercase thing, and see if we want to keep that. Yeah?
I would say literature often conveys aspects of the human condition.
Literature conveys aspects of the human condition. Doesn't history writing or sociology or philosophy or religion or... I didn't say that. So, okay, one of the things you might say about that is, yeah, but therefore it has things in common with all those things. So that's fine. Except we tend to think of literature as something separate or doing something that's different from those. Or let's just put it another way. In the course of the years that we're going to be looking through, there are people who are going to be writers who are going to have a vested interest in trying to define the literary as not like those other things. So it's going to, you might say, it's going to convey aspects of the human condition in a particular way, or maybe get at aspects that those other stupid disciplines don't get at. Okay, good, we can work with that. Anything else? Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of like the umbrella term for a lot of, it encompasses a lot of different subgenres, I guess.
Okay.
So, like,
We would,
the way that we speak about classic, the way that we speak about...
Good, that's good. There's many different subgenres, and there's the idea of the classic built into literary. That's good. But let's work on this. What's the difference between literature, if we want to say there is a difference, what's the difference between literature and all writing? I've suggested we might want to make that distinction. So how are we going to draw that distinction, and who's going to draw it? Yeah?
Would it be okay to bring in like the idea of artistic aspirations, or at least...
Would it be okay? I don't know. With me, you mean? I'm happy to talk. Artistic aspirations. Well, that goes back to the idea of the horizon of expectations, right? I mean, we might say that the literary has a set of aspirations that we would call the literary. People are always worried. Why are we worried about this? Because there's something that we've all heard about called the intentional fallacy. We've probably heard about this. How many of you have heard of the intentional fallacy? Anybody ever say that to you? Intentional fallacy was part of that whole new criticism thing. It basically boils down to this. You shouldn't judge the greatness or success of a literary work depending on its author's intentions. In part because you can't always know the author's intentions, and also because the authors aren't completely in control of his or her intentions, right? I mean, you don't even need to go to, say, Freudian psychology or psychoanalysis to suggest that there are going to be things that occur in the act of writing that aren't exactly planned. And there would only be a certain kind of writer who is absolutely in control of every single thing that goes on when he or she sets down a particular configuration of words, right? On the other hand, we don't want to discount intention totally. There's intention when you pick up something that looks like a novel. We say, okay, they intended to write a novel. There's something to be done with that. There's intention lies in, and we might say, we can look and say, we know enough to say that that person decided to write a literary novel. Okay, great. Does that mean it's literature? You know, person X, Dan Brown might have said, I want to write a literary novel. And maybe he thinks he did. Would we agree? Some of you might agree and it's okay. How about this? Is Stephen King novel, your average Stephen King novel, literature or not literature? How many say literature? Oh, come on. More than you think. How many of you say not literature? Oh, come on. No wishy-washy. Start again. Literature. Hands up. All right, that's better. Better showing. Not literature. Hands up. Third category. I didn't tell you there was going to be a third category. Literature in some books, but not others. You know, Bag of Bones, that's literature. Scribner's. And Carrie, that was back in the great days. King, by the way, is a remarkably good writer, I think. And if you want to learn about writing, you should read his book on writing, especially his screed against adverbs. It's brilliant. In fact, I think I'll post it to Blackboard so you can have it. Yes? Okay. Lowercase and capital again, yes.
If it's like a novel, you could say that goes under the lowercase literature, which is kind of like the written word in general, that we give certain...
Wait, novels are lowercase and poetry is uppercase?
Well, I mean, we give...
I work on prose, you know.
We give the title of the uppercase literature to like certain books that like critics or like the audience like deems, okay, this is the higher standard of writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, like something like
Okay.
the classics or that kind of different books that we pick out and say these ones are special, so they're capital literature.
Okay, that's a possibility. We certainly could think about whether it's useful to think, let's talk about this, and you can talk about it in section meetings. Is it useful to make a distinction between something that we might call literature with a capital L and smaller literature with a lowercase l? But might we also want to think about it, in terms of proper nouns versus other things? I mean, one of the things that American literature would suggest to us is that one of the things that we mean when we say a literature is a kind of institution of culture, right? American literature connotes a set of books. Some textbooks, anthologies, syllabi, tests, all this stuff. It's part of a large institution that has to do with publishing and universities, and it's a big thing. And maybe lowercase literature is something that lets us get at aspects of text or reading or writing that are separate from that institutionalized set of practices. Yeah?
I remember in literature, the literature was defined as a body of works that a specific culture decides is valuable and worth studying, revisiting. So especially in regard to Dan Brown or Stephen King or whatever, it's specifically to the culture that if we decide that it's important, we decide that it's actually worth putting into the category of literature, that it deems it worthy of it. Not.
So literature is, very well put, something that a particular culture has decided is worthy and should be preserved and read and studied and carried forward and, extrapolating from January 19th, 2010 forward, yeah, Dan Brown will be on those syllabi in 100 years. You know it. Yes?
Just adding on to that, the fact that I think that literature is, the idea of concept of literature is part of the narrative expectations. That if you have a culture creating your literature, creating their own canon, then, the notion of literature is something that grows out of what a society decides is good. And, there are all sorts of factors that decide what is good.
Yeah, that's good. Literature grows out of what a society decides is good. So one of the things we need to think about is how does a society decide anything? Because I think you're right. But part of what we're going to be investigating is how does cultural change happen? In a word like society, your description of it gives that agency, as if the society could do something. But clearly a society is also, it doesn't, the actions of a society perhaps only can be understood in retrospect. In the present moment, it looks like the actions, the sum total of actions of individuals. So how does, the horizon of expectations actually functions as, you might say, the summation of all of the collection of different horizons of expectations. All of you are going to have your own individual horizons of expectations. And they are, again, going to be based on your experience, the historical moment, but your particular experience is going to make them slightly different from one another. Most likely, I'm guessing they're going to fundamentally overlap in some key ways, but they're not necessarily always going to be the same. Some people might think something is literary and something is not, and there would be those two judgments would rise out of different, you might say, horizons of expectations conditioned by different personal experiences. So we want to think about it. That's a sum total. Just as when we might say when a society acts, it's somehow the sum total of individual actions. So we want to think about how cultural change happens, using as a prism the acts of individuals, which are the particular writing acts of the people that we're going to be studying. One of the things I think we can suggest, at least as our hypothesis now, is that literature is something that's constructed by a society. It tends to be an expression of a certain set of values that society might take to be important or worth preserving. But it is constructed. And what happens is it becomes a kind of institution of culture. What do you suppose literature means to the Puritans that we're going to start reading next week? Does it mean the novel? Does it mean drama? Does it mean lyric poetry? No. What do you think it means? If they don't use it, if they use the term, which they tended not to. Yeah. Religion. So the highest work of literature, pretty much the only one you needed, was a certain one book. The Bible, yeah. Everything else is kind of emendations to the Bible. So what the Puritans would have considered worthy of if they were thinking about the literary, they would have thought of the Bible, they would have thought of sermons, histories, biographies, fiction. Doesn't that mean lies? Doesn't that mean untruth? Isn't that storytelling? Something happens in the course of the period that we're looking at to change our understanding of what the literary it is. We have a post-romantic notion of the literary. Romantic writers in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States are actively engaged in a process of redefining what the literary means, linking it to aesthetic experience, linking it to the imagination and the inward life, and suggesting that it is a discipline unto its own, separate from all those other ones, from religion and history and philosophy and all these things. And some of them would claim that, in fact, it's the highest discipline. And they wouldn't even have been the first. I mean, Philip Sidney was talking about poetry being the queen of all of the disciplines, right? So I want you to get a sense of that. We need to historicize, in this course, our understanding of what literature and the literary are. They mean something to us today, and that factors into our horizon of expectations. They meant something different in the 1600s and into the 1700s, and we need to remember that as we read those texts. Okay? All right, let's talk about America and American. What does that mean? You might, if you've been listening closely, you've noticed that I've slipped periodically from American to saying U.S. to... What's the difference between American and U.S.? America has to refer to both North America and South America, doesn't it? Well, yeah, probably if we were being...
American, say I'm American, I mean, they'll probably know what you're saying, but it's not true.
They'll know what you're saying, but it's not true.
It's not so distinctive that you can...
So if you were in Paris and you're saying, oh, I'm going to America next week, they probably wouldn't expect Buenos Aires, right? Okay, that's good. So let's think about what's at stake in that. U.S. and American aren't exactly the same. There's a sense in which America is a lie. If you take America to mean North America only, or even the U.S., there's a sense in which that's metaphorical speech. On the other hand, you say, but people understand. So we're all skittish about using the term America, and yet it has kind of cultural currency. There's a certain way in which America is constructed both in the United States and abroad, and there's certain agreement about its meanings. Yes?
Well, I know my mom's from Mexico, and she doesn't like to say the United States because the full name of Mexico is Los Estados Unidos de Mexico. So to her, Mexico is also the United States.
It's the USM?
Yeah, I guess. But whenever you say like the U.S. and the United States, she also thinks of.
So what does she want to say?
Well, I don't know.
So she doesn't want to say American, probably, and she doesn't want to say, yeah, that's a pickle.
I think if I were making a difference between America and the United States, I think it would come from the fact that it didn't become the United States until 1776, when all the colonies became united. Well, maybe not until the ratification of the Constitution.
Okay, so we might say that maybe, I mean, certainly in the literature of the period, you say America, you're talking about this large kind of continent that's not fully explored. That's part of the, the pre-Enlightenment era, the era of settlement and discovery. And after that, we maybe should be saying something else? Yeah?
I think that, at least today, when you say the word American, it kind of conveys more of a sense of, kind of like culture, but kind of like patriotism, more than just the United States. It conveys more of just a technical term for the country.
So you think, so you think if you say, somebody asks you, where are you from? You say, I'm an American. Does that mean you're making a patriotic statement?
I don't know that I would, but I think that that's kind of.
Well, what else would you say? I guess you could say, I come from the United States. I'd probably say I'm a New Yorker. But yeah.
I guess the difference between the United States of America and American is I view American as, defining a whole set of shared history, shared customs, not necessarily even a shared language, but a shared American experience.
Okay, we might say that it has validity because it does precisely that, as you say. It conveys the sense of a shared experience which transcends many different kinds of boundaries. It's a certain kind of consensus, but it also, it isn't the same as the political entity known as the United States of America. It possibly is something larger. It's possibly a kind of mythical place that every now and then overlap, and not as often as we like we might say, overlaps with that actual political entity called the United States of America. Yeah.
I think the difference is also that American is an adjective. It's not a place. There's American goods, American clothes, American media, and that's
Okay.
doesn't necessarily have to do with your nationality, but a style.
It's easy, right? Easier to say American than U.S. U.S. is sounds kind of, you can't say United States. Yeah. Well, okay, it's easier. And I think that's fine. And it's part of our common culture. So you know what I want you to do? I want you to inwardly cringe every time you use the word, just to be a little self-conscious about it. Because what I want you to understand is that America, American, all that, the way we use it and the way we use it, and it gets understood so that people understand what we mean, all of that is metaphorical. Or we might say that America fundamentally is a trope. It's figurative language. And we need to keep that in mind. We're going to see a whole lot of unself-conscious uses of it, but we want to be self-conscious about it. Just as in the same way that we want to be self-conscious about every act of meaning-making that we witness in the course of our reading and that we engage in the course of our thinking and writing this term. Right? It's a trope. Now, it can be a trope that signifies inclusion. I'm going to put up a wonderful sonnet that actually really buys into this idea of America as something that means more than just the United States, that does mean a set of shared values. It means this set of shared values. Would somebody like to read this for us? Yes, loudly. Stand up, please. Really.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air bridge harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Thank you. Let's give her a round. Hey, it's not easy to stand up in the middle of everybody and do that. And I'm going to be asking people to be doing that in the course of the term. So, thank you very much. Is that familiar to anybody? Any of it? Yeah? Where and why? Statue of Liberty, yes. The Bartholdi pedestal. This was written in part to try to raise funds for it. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Come, welcome. Is that what we say in this country? Is that what they said yesterday in Massachusetts? Inclusion is a nice idea, and many people came to the United States in the late 19th century and in the time that Lazarus is writing with that dream of inclusion. And they found it, some of them, and some of them didn't. Right? America is a trope for inclusion. It's also a trope for exclusion at the same time. And that's one of the things about figurative language. Figurative language can embody paradox. And it's almost always more interesting when it does. That's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. So one of the things we might say is that a guy named William Prescott writes a book in the 19th century called The Conquest of Mexico. A lot of people read it. A man named George Bancroft writes a book called The History of the United States. And when Prescott reviews George Bancroft's History of the United States, he doesn't see any connection between the idea of conquest that he's written about in the Mexican context and the history of the United States. Rather, he sees in Bancroft's account the idea that the history of the United States of America is somehow providential. What does that mean? Do you know? We will know more about that in a couple weeks, but yeah. It's the will of God. It's foreordained. It's providence. It's God's providence. Puritan, big word for the Puritans. So you can see that history writing somehow is part of this larger rhetoric of the providential. This is the same moment that the term manifest destiny starts to be coined, right? Middle of the 1840s. Okay? So you might say that there's certain kinds of exclusion that are based on the United States versus the rest of the world, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. There are certain other kinds of exclusion, which we might talk about. There was a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner who, in 1893, gave an address on the significance of the frontier in American history at the Chicago Exposition. Fascinating cultural thing if you are ever interested in thinking about cultural sites. There was a big architecture, there were pavilions, all this kind of stuff was built. It was called the White City because so many of the buildings were white buildings that were temporary structures, but they were designed to enshrine neoclassical ideas. That was the vision of America that was being put forward. And Turner writes about the fact that the West has officially been closed, right? There's no more westward expansion. And he says that one of the things that accounts for the American character, the way it is the existence of the frontier. The frontier has created certain kinds of values, ruggedness, inventiveness, individualism. And now the challenge will be how to maintain those values with the closing of the frontier. That was incredibly influential. Today we would say it's kind of more like myth-making than real history writing, but it set the pattern, you might say, for a lot of historical analysis, became one of the founding ideas in American studies. One of the founding books in the discipline that's known as American Studies is a book called Virgin Land, Myth and Symbol in American Literature. Virgin Land, what does that mean? Yeah. Untouched land. Meaning the American continent, right? The Europeans came, they found virgin land, they were able to have this frontier, it formed their manly ruggedness, and we are Americans because of that. So that was taken to be history, right? What's the problem with that? Yeah, there were kind of people here. But we exclude those from that conception. That particular myth of America excludes those, right? This is what Turner actually said. That coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, that practical, inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, that masterful grasp of material things, lacking in the artistic but powerful to effect great ends, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism, working for good and for evil, and with all that buoyancy and exuberance which comes with freedom. These are the traits of the frontier, or traits called out elsewhere because of the existence of the frontier. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that Reagan and Bush too, all these people draw on. This rhetoric of what a true America is. And as we can see, it's predicated on a hidden kind of exclusion that we don't want to talk about. So individualism is one of the hallmarks, you might say, of the American self, according to a large number of commentators. What does individualism exclude? Is what our little analysis of Turner's writing might lead us to ask. Toni Morrison has an idea about that. Toni Morrison has written and then talked. There's a famous moment from an interview that she gave in Time magazine in which she talks about the engine of American census. What makes American? Some people would say individualism, the Turner frontier, all that kind of stuff, right? She says it's a different thing. Something else that makes most Americans feel like they're American. She said, in 1989, I feel personally sorrowful about black-white relations a lot of time because black people have always been used as a buffer in this country between powers to prevent class war, to prevent other kinds of real conflagrations. If there were no black people here in this country, it would have been balkanized. The immigrants would have torn each other's throats out as they've done everywhere else. But in becoming an American from Europe, what one has in common with that other immigrant. So again, immigrants, think of the Lazarus immigrant, New Colossus kind of image. What that has in common with the other immigrant is contempt for me. It's nothing else but color. Where they were from, they would stand together. Wherever they were from, they would stand together. They could all say, I am not that. So in that sense, becoming an American, she says, is based on an attitude and exclusion of me, not inclusiveness, not individualism, exclusion of a particular type, set of people. It wasn't negative to them, she says. It was unifying. When they got off the boat, the second word they learned was nigger. Ask them. I grew up with them. I remember in the 5th grade, a smart little boy who had just arrived and didn't speak any English. He sat next to me. I read well. I taught him to read just by doing it. I remember the moment he found out that I was black, a nigger. It took him 6 months, he was told. And that's the moment when he belonged. That was his entrance. Every immigrant knew he would not come as the very bottom. He had to come above at least one group, and that was us. And of course, one of the things we see here is that among the things that are culturally constructed is that notion of blackness. It's one of the other things we're going to be talking about. To what extent is one of the things that American literature that it's trying to contend with is the presence of the people that the Turner hypothesis excludes, and that are excluded, legally as well. The presence of people of color, whether they be Native Americans or African Americans or later on Mexican Americans, any number of people that don't fit a certain kind of Euro-American paradigm. To what extent is that, you might say, the big problem with which American literature is trying to contend? Sometimes to paper over, sometimes to actually engage with. We'll come up with both of those versions in the course of the term. So again, what I want to stress is that America is a trope. It signifies inclusion and exclusion both. It signifies providence, individualism, and racism too, and a number of other forms of discrimination that we will be talking about later course of the term. All of this is part of America, and therefore all of this is part of American literature. Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is from where? Declaration of Independence, a statement of universal principles, right? The basis for American intellectual culture, the basis for our country. And there are people, you would find textbooks that would say, well, it's kind of written in the language of the 18th century a little bit. You know, that all men thing, they meant people. They would say, well, they transcended their moment. They created a set of principles that could evolve and adapt and move forward as the country did. That's all true. But only in a deeply racist and patriarchal culture could you say that all men are created equal means that all people are created equal. They meant men. Did women vote? No. Believe me, Abigail gave John shit about this. He really was, he wasn't happy about it. When do women vote? In the beginning of the 20th century, okay? They didn't mean all men are created equal. Or if they did, they had a very metaphorical understanding of what men was, or they had a very literal understanding of what men is, and also a very metaphorical one, because it didn't mean all men, did it? No, not Native Americans, not African Americans, not right. And basically meant white, property-owning, European, and derived males. So I want you to look at this and see that this too is figurative language. Figurative language is all over the place, and it's part of our job as literary and cultural critics to understand it and decode it and understand what its power is. And these guys, people like Jefferson, were men of the Enlightenment. They understood the power of the written word, and so did the people that settled the United States. The age of discovery is in part the age of writing. Okay? Columbus sails not too long after. It's roughly contemporary with the Gutenberg Bible. All right? Text is about to explode across the European continent. And discovery, the age of discovery, is all part of that. Melville, writing a sea novel in the middle of the 19th century, is part of a long history that associates the sea and text and imperialism and conquest and race. All of these things become a kind of nexus of associations. That's part of what we're going to be trying to untangle in the course of the term. This guy, Christopher Columbus, he knew the importance of writing. He wrote letters back to his patrons in Spain, and you will read a couple of them. A diary of his is preserved, the Diario of Christopher Columbus. We know that he wrote a lot when he was trying to find the Americas. And Jefferson, too, knew the importance of writing. He told this to Lewis and Clark as they were doing their scientific explorations. Your observations are to be taken with great pains and accuracy, to be devoted to enter distinctly and intelligibly for others as well as yourself. Okay, so these guys are tromping through unknown woods, and periodically they have to sit down and write. And not just one of them, all of them. They're all writing. Thousands of pages are produced by the Lewis and Clark expeditions, with the aid of the usual tables to fix the latitude and the longitudes of the places at which they were taken, and are to be read into the State Department. The precursor of the State Department. They are to be rendered to the War Office for the purpose of having the calculations made concurrently by proper persons within the U.S. Is this scientific exploration? To take possession of a continent, really, you need to write your way across it. That's what Jefferson knows. Writing is powerful. Several copies of these, as well as your other notes, should be made at leisure times and put into the care of the most trustworthy of your attendants to guard by multiplying them against the accidental losses to which they would be exposed. This is my favorite bit. A further guard would be that one of these copies be written on the paper of the birch, as less liable to injury from damp than common paper. They wanted that writing preserved and sent back there. Okay, so one of the things I want you to understand right away is the importance of writing to the age of discovery and the age of imperialism. And one more thing. You know those people that didn't exist in the Virgin Land? You know why? One of the reasons they weren't thought to be people at all or worthy of notice? They didn't write. North American Indians didn't have a written tradition. They had literature. Yes, it was oral. For the Europeans, that didn't rate. Look for those moments when you start to read Columbus or some of the other early settlement narrative excerpts that we have, when they talk about what they're looking for. Columbus is looking for kings and cities. He doesn't find them where he looks in North America. He finds all kinds of resources and people without number, he says, but nothing of importance. Okay, last things. One of the things, so this is what we're going to be doing over the weekend. We're going to be looking at, you might say, the land chapters of Moby Dick. And we're going to use those as a kind of overture for the course. We're going to use those to frame the matter of the course from the early settlement narratives all the way down through some of the concerns of American Romanticism. And we will therefore frame the course with Moby Dick. So you're going to get your feet wet by reading the land chapters, and then we'll come back to the sea chapters at the end of the term. That's one thing you're going to be doing over the weekend. You're also going to be reading a wonderful essay by Stephen Greenblatt. This is an excerpt from it that talks about what cultural analysis is when literary people do it, and why cultural analysis is necessarily rooted in formal analysis, in textual analysis. Close reading turns out to be about culture too. And in Greenblatt's conception, a masterpiece, a powerful work of art, encodes much of its culture within it. To understand the culture, read texts. But to understand the text, you need to read the culture as well. So this is a kind of reciprocal relation, what we might say is a more fluid relationship between text and context than you might have been led to expect earlier. That's one of the things that we're going to be doing as well over the weekend. For section meetings which meet this week, please bring Moby Dick. You don't need to read any of it. You'll be looking at bits of it in class. If you do feel like reading it, read it from the beginning. Read the title page, the dedication, and just look at the early pages. Does that look like a novel to you? What the hell was this guy doing? Okay, that's part of what you're going to understand. You should understand the practice of back in the old days, and you can still do this on a Kindle, right? Kindle lets you beam a few pages to see if you want to buy the book, or back when we used to go to bookstores, we might browse and look at the first few pages to decide if we wanted to read the book or not. I'm here to tell you that that's actually a valid way of thinking, because what books do in their first few pages is set the ground rules for interpretation. So what you'll be looking at in section this week is what kind of ground rules for interpretation are there. All right, before you go, last couple of things. The lectures do a certain kind of work. We might think of it as kind of literary historical, and I will be doing some close readings of moments within the text. But the section meetings are crucial to this course, and if you have to pick something to miss me, do not miss your section. We have wonderful, brilliant section leaders. They are sitting up there. I'm going to quickly introduce them to you. In reverse alphabetical order, it's Cara Zavarella. Give it up for Cara. Stephanie Wess. And our token male, Brendan Byrne. Okay, there's been a slight change on the syllabus. Cara will be taking the Thursday sections and not the Friday sections. Now, there are wait lists for the Thursday sections. There are also issues with the space in the room of those Thursday sections. If you are on the wait list for a Thursday section, you need to email me today and tell me why you have to be on that in that section and cannot be in one of the Friday ones. If you have a good reason, we will do our very best to accommodate you. Okay? That's one thing to note. You must go to sections. We take attendance in lecture. We take attendance in section. There's a big portion of the grade which is participation in section. Go to section. Okay? Am I forgetting anything else, guys? All right. We're off on our great adventure together.